Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randall and Gus Kearns.
Welcome in, listeners, to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we're always talking everything college hoops. You could have been anywhere else on the dial, but you chose to be here with us, Mike and Gus. And not only are we here, but Brendan Marks from The Athletic is here to talk some UNC basketball and some ACC basketball. Brendan, thank you so much for giving the podcast a little bit of your valuable time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk college hoops.
So are we. So glad we're meeting right in the middle where we should. Brendan, let's recap last year for the Tar Heels. Last year was completely unfamiliar for the Tar Heel family, so foreign that Hall of Fame head coach Roy Williams decided to step aside. Can you recap some of those elements that held hope and maybe some of those awry elements last year in Chapel Hill?
Yeah, obviously I think the situation at UNC last season was in one respect similar to something that every college program ran through, and that UNC struggled with bringing in a lot of new arrivals and trying to get them to incorporate themselves while undergoing these, pretty daunting pandemic protocols. And so at North Carolina specifically, the summer is a time where kids usually come in early. They have the whole summer to go through and practice with, former players and professionals. And, Tyler Hansbrough comes back. And, what better learning resource for kids of that age? And not having that was obviously a detriment. I think another thing that really ended up hurting UNC was there never seemed to be any sense of consistency with the lineup. And I think part of that was the fact that Roy Williams at a number of key positions was trying to break in people on the fly. At the point guard spot between Caleb Love and RJ Davis, he had two guys who incredibly talented, but neither of them had ever really been a full-time point guard before. And they ended up having to sort of both try and figure it out on the fly. And on the flip side of that, in the interior, in the post, you've got four dudes, all of whom deserve serious playing time, two of whom are freshmen, and you can't really give them the time that they probably deserve. And figuring out the rotation got a little murky. So between getting off to a tough start, constantly trying to mix and match lineups, it was certainly not a season that UNC fans were familiar with, and one that they hope doesn't happen again anytime soon.
I bet. And speaking of that, I think you mentioned some of the challenges with the lineup, rotation, playing time. How about COVID? COVID was an issue everywhere. It was impossible to navigate for anybody in college sports. So what were some of the unique challenges that UNC kind of ran through and jumped over hurdles to try to find ways to compete, and maybe some of the other hurdles inside the ACC?
Yeah, I think at North Carolina specifically, probably the best example I can give you is in the case of one player specifically, and Walker Kessler. So Walker Kessler comes in. He was a 5-star, top 15 rated freshman, supposed to be one of the best young big men in the country. And unfortunately ended up being a close contact to somebody else who contracted COVID. And as a result, strictly, he never contracted the virus himself, but because he was a close contact, he ended up missing 2 weeks very early on in the season. So right from the beginning, this is a guy who's supposed to come in and make an impact. He's behind before practices have even started. Not only that, but he's out of shape. When they were in COVID quarantine, you're literally stuck in your room. You can't go, you can't work out, you can't run. I mean, you can do push-ups and whatever you want, in your dorm, on your bed or whatever, but there's only so much you can do in that situation realistically. So just one example of some of the challenges, and that was something really that he was fighting to get over all the way up through January and February. And that's obviously when he started to play his best, and there was a reason why. And around the ACC, I think it was a similar thing. I spent a lot of time over at Duke as well. And for Duke, usually they bring in their athletes in the first week of June, which gives them the entirety of the summer to get acclimated. For the freshmen especially, they come in and have a month just by themselves to learn where buildings are, to learn where their classes are. And last year, Duke was the last program in the ACC to bring kids back, brought them back in August, so a full 2 months later than normal, and then didn't actually let them start practicing until almost September. So not only are you putting yourselves 3 months behind, but that's 3 months of work that you can't make up. That's time you're not getting back. So again, it was something that everybody had to deal with, and it affected everyone in different ways. But certainly in the case of those two schools, very tangible, reasons why their seasons ended up not going the way I think they would have liked for them to.
Makes perfect sense. It's a brilliant recap and really starts to put the puzzle together when we reflected back upon last season for both programs specifically. We're talking to Brendan Marks. You can give him a follow over at Twitter at Brendan R. Marks. And of course, you can follow all of his fine work over at The Athletic, CBB, and of course, theathletic.com. Brendan, thank you again. And so some of these changes, one of the major changes, it's Coach Hubert Davis. He's going to follow Old Roy. Brendan, why might this work? Why might it fall on its face?
Yeah, I think if you're being an optimist, then you look at the fact that right now, outside of Roy Williams, I don't know if there's anyone in the world who understands North Carolina basketball as fundamentally as Hubert Davis does. He played there. He still maintains records there. He's still the program's all-time leading three-point shooter by percentage. He went to the NBA, was able to rep Carolina at the next level. This is the only place he's ever coached. He'd been an assistant for 9 years and had won a national championship, had been to another Final Four. Nobody understood what it takes to exist and to thrive in North Carolina the way that he does. And also on top of that, I think you look at the fact that a number of North Carolina's key recruiting wins in the past 5 or 6 years have come because of Hubert Davis. He's been the lead recruiter on those. And hopefully, and as he's already started to, will continue to bring that caliber of player to North Carolina. On the flip side of things, if you're a pessimist, and there is obviously reason for some apprehension here, he's never been a head coach before, and he's taking over a program that is one of the most illustrious in the entire country. So that's obviously very daunting. Just figuring out, I think, what to do on a day-to-day basis. He's been able to surround himself with smart people, but until you're actually there, until you're actually calling the plays in the moment, even last year and in the past couple of seasons when Roy Williams was out, whether it was a spell of his vertigo or something else entirely, Hubert was not the assistant who stepped in as the acting head coach. That was Steve Robinson. So when he steps out for his first game as head coach, it is literally going to be his first game ever. So obviously, you hope that he carries that knowledge and can parlay it into in-game decisions, but it's easier to project that than it is to actually do it in the moment.
And it seems like he hasn't got the exact fanfare that maybe a Juwan Howard back at Michigan, a Penny back at Memphis, that type of situation, even Speedy Claxton, back at Hofstra, if we want to go, small school as well. It's almost like people forgot that Hubert Davis was a really successful NBA player and a really successful Tar Heel, that because he's been on the bench so long, because he did his little studio work. Yeah, I'm with you. It seems like he should be lumped in with them, but somehow he's kind of isolated from them somehow. One of the changes is the transfer portal, Brendan, and UNC dipped in like kind of never before. Can you talk to the listeners about some of the new transfers, and maybe that can lead to like the change in philosophy that Hubert Davis is going to employ on the sidelines? Because it seems like you have bigs that might be able to space now, as opposed to the traditional let's offensive rebound the heck out of the ball bigs and try to get up and down and just post up on the block. So talk about the transfer portal a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you look at the guys that Hubert Davis brought in, the three transfers, Justin McCoy from Virginia, Brady Manick from Oklahoma, and Dawson Garcia from Marquette. You bring in those three guys, and they're really illustrative of the way he wants to play and the way that the playing style that UNC will have under him will be different than it was under not just his immediate predecessor, but really any coach that UNC has had dating back to Dean Smith. Dean Smith, Bill Guthridge, and Roy Williams all sort of ran the same Carolina break system, like you mentioned, two bigs running the floor, dominating the offensive glass. And that's not going to completely disappear, but certainly Hubert, given what he was good at as a player, which was shooting the ball, spacing the floor, that's what he's going to prioritize. And I think he understands that that is also the direction that the modern game, both at the professional and the college level, is moving. So in Brady Manick, for example, this is a guy who in all 4 of his years at Oklahoma made over 35% of his three-point shots. I actually spoke to Hubert this morning for a story I'm working on, and he said Brady is going to be the best big man shooter to ever play in North Carolina history. If you take his numbers from what he had done when he was at Oklahoma, he would be, I think third all time in North Carolina three-pointers. So he's immediately going to come in and be able to provide that. He's also someone at Oklahoma who played small ball center. So he's someone who has that versatility, can play inside, can play outside. And I think that's sort of the style of big man that Hubert's going to prefer. You see the same thing with Dawson Garcia, who was someone that North Carolina recruited out of high school, really liked a lot. He's a guy who torched the Tar Heels in the Smith Center last season. And so he comes in and he's really, I think, probably the most versatile player on the roster. He legitimately can play center or power forward traditionally. He can play it inside. but he's got a projectable 3-point shot, and it absolutely works from the perimeter. Yesterday we had an open practice, and we could see him flashing some of those shooting skills. Justin McCoy, honestly, was probably the least heralded of the three from Virginia. Comes in as, he was the lowest rated of the three coming into college. He's the guy who I think is going to surprise people the most. His shot is a little bit slow, but it's incredibly efficient. And I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up competing to start at the three this year. I think that when you look at what he provides defensively, again, this is someone who's 6'8", but excels at offensive rebounding. So if you play him at a forward spot, he's still capable of you providing and mitigating some of the lost inside rebounding that you would have had from not having two bigs. So all three of them are versatile floor spacers who can also play inside when they need to. And so I think that you're going to see Hubert continue as he builds through the transfer portal, as he builds through high school. If he's not able to bring in those guys in high school who do have that skill set, he's absolutely willing to go into the transfer portal and pull them out if he has to. I think it's just going to sort of be a year-by-year basis depending on what the roster looks like.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think you mentioned the versatility. Like the cross-section of their skill sets is completely it's brand new to what UNC would have with their traditional big men. So you nailed it right on the head there. And speaking of more fresh faces, the Tar Heels always bring in big-time freshmen. What youngsters on the roster on the perimeter that might help Coach Davis project to winning this particular season when we find, floor time that's going to matter?
Right. Yeah. And this is a deep roster. Let's just say that right off the bat. I mean, if these young guys are going to crack the rotation, they're going to really have to bust their butts because there's a lot of talented guys on this roster, but there's two of them. And I think that they both have an opportunity to get on the floor right away. And probably I start with Dontrez Styles, who comes in. He is sort of in the same body type as Leaky Black. He's 6'6", 6'7", very muscular, very cut, just absolutely bursting with energy. Maybe has the longest wingspan on the team proportionally to his height. I mean, yesterday during handling drills, he's basically scratching his knuckles on the floor when he's just standing at a, basic pace, which is crazy to imagine. I think he's a guy who's going to come in and provide some of that energy and rebounding and defense right away. And UNC's defense absolutely needs the boost. It needs those young legs. And it needs guys like Dontrez who have the length and the strength to compete with bigger bodies, but also the quickness to compete with smaller bodies in the perimeter. So he can do a little bit of both, which I think is enticing. And then the other freshman, Demarco Dunn, really provides the one thing the Tar Heels need more than anything, which is shooting. He can shoot the ball from the outside. He can shoot it in the mid-range. He can shoot it off the pull-up. He's a guy that I think UNC, especially when they are having some of those shooting struggles, and there are going to be games where, people struggle to put the ball in the hole. He's a guy that I think Hubert Davis is going to be able to turn to and say, all right, get in there and do what you do. He's someone who I think the rest of his skill set probably needs some more development, but right away, immediately off the bat, he understands how to get open. He understands how to get his shot off. He's not passive about hunting for it. And he's going to make some shots this year.
Tremendous breakdown. And Dontrez Styles, the comparison to Leaky Black, I don't know if UNC fans will smile when they hear that or if they'll be still have their, shoulders up I don't know. We'll see. All right, let's talk a little bit about those returning players a tiny bit. I mean, you mentioned Leaky Black, you mentioned Caleb Love, RJ Davis. Tell the listeners who's going to have the hands on the ball in decision-making time, less than a minute to go, one possession game. Of the veterans that are going to come back, who is Coach Davis going to lean on in that situation?
Yeah, I think, on the perimeter, certainly there's a ton of pressure on Caleb Love. He comes in last year, is a projected, first round pick as a freshman, supposed to be a one and done guy, and ends up having not a bad season, but a historically inefficient season. Caleb Love is the first high major player since 1993 to take over 300 shots, but make fewer than 32% from the field and fewer than 27% from three. That's not a historical company that you want to be a part of. So he obviously is going to have to make better decisions. He also led the team in turnovers on a team that led the ACC in turnovers. So again, two major things that he has to get a hand of: picking better shots, being more efficient, picking his spots on the floor specifically, and then just really taking care of the ball. And it seems like he definitely has progressed more in the former than I think a lot of people would have expected. He understands when he can be aggressive and attack the basket. He understands when he can be aggressive and draw defenses in and open up an opportunity for someone else. And he understands, look, I got people around me who could play. I can get them the ball and they can do their thing. So I think that he's really going to have, I wrote a column today. I don't know that Caleb Love has to be UNC's best player, but I certainly feel that as the season progresses and even early on, he is going to be its most important, just because he is the person who's going to have to make the most of the decisions. As for another returner that Hubert Davis is really going to lean on, it's Armando Bacot. Last year's leading scorer, last year's leading rebounder, doesn't have that versatility maybe so much, is more of a traditional big man, is going to dominate, I think, inside. Shot 67% last year on 2-pointers. Hubert Davis still wants him to have 3-point opportunities if they're available, but he's going to make his bread inside. That's where he makes his money. That's where he's best at. So I think those two are really going to be two of the bedrocks of this team. I'd expect them to be among the 2 or 3 leading scorers. And again, as long as they play within the confines of themselves, that's not a bad thing for UNC fans.
That sounds promising. Let's talk about, obviously, the biggest story, not just in the ACC, but also probably college basketball this particular season. The overarching story heading into the season has to be Coach K stepping aside after this season comes to completion. Can you provide the listeners with something, an element, something to look for, something to listen for during that final, whether it be UNC Duke matchup or just during the ACC season, that is going to be, one where each stop is written about, is detailed. What do we need to look for or listen for during Coach K's final season?
Yeah, there's one thing specifically that I'm listening for, and I think that other people would be interested in it too. Coach K hasn't won 5 national titles and more games than any other coach in the men's college game by being sentimental. He hasn't won all those games, and he hasn't won all of that by being overly sappy, by being too appreciative of things, by looking ahead of anything. So I've asked him a couple of times since he sort of announced his transition, his impending retirement in different forums, and he repeats the same thing over and over. He says, "This is not my last season. I'm not approaching it as my last season. I'm approaching it as my 42nd season at Duke and my 47th season overall." Because, and his thinking basically is, if you start moving the goalposts, so you start saying this is the last XYZ, the last first practice, the last UNC game, the last time I'm playing in Cameron, the last time I'm playing Virginia or Syracuse or whoever. When you start doing that and introducing emotion into the equation, you rationalize subpar performance. And you say, okay, I am, regardless of what happens here, this is my last time, I got to enjoy it. And for him, that is not what he's here to enjoy. He's not here to enjoy going to these venues one more time. He's not here to enjoy having a final game in Cameron, although obviously he will. He's here to win. And so if you let emotion and you let sentimentality creep into the equation, it mitigates the idea that we still have something to play for at the end, because it makes it okay to just savor the moment in the moment. So he told his staff actually, and has told his players not to use the word last around him, just not to use it whatsoever, cut it from their vocabularies. I'd be interested to see if at any point this season that changes. And I'll be interested to see, as Duke does get into the ACC tournament, say, I would assume they're going to be in the NCAA tournament. At what point do we hear some of that start to creep in? Or do we not hear it creep in at all? And does he sort of stick to his guns about eyes on the prize and nothing else matters?
It'll be interesting to see if he sticks to the script or if the emotions and the moment get the best of him and he, opens up a tiny bit. All right. Excellent, Brendan. Take a peek at the non-conference schedule for UNC, and they're never shy about trying to schedule on the non-conference slate. The season holds that form for sure. What games do you think should be circled in Sharpie for UNC prior to jumping into ACC play?
Yeah, there's really 4 for me that stand out more than any others. I think, first and foremost, you look at UNC is going to play in an MTE, a multi-team event up at Mohegan Sun. Going to start off against Purdue, and really the other 2 teams there, Tennessee and Villanova, they'll play they'll play one of the other 2 teams the next day. Those 2 games, I think, are going to be a really good barometer early for how much the team has understood the way Hubert Davis wants to play. And obviously against high quality competition, Purdue is a legitimate Final Four team. Villanova is always one of the best teams in the country. Tennessee has certainly been rejuvenated by their recruiting lately. The 2 others that I look at, or UNC is going to host Michigan as part of the ACC Big Ten Challenge. Again, Michigan, we're talking about a team that brought in one of the best recruiting classes in the country, returns Hunter Dickinson, who is probably going to be a preseason All-American. That's going to be a great barometer for how does Hubert Davis's style, is it still as effective when you're going against a dominant interior man like Michigan is going to have? Armando Bacot, for example, that game is going to have to play lights out. And then the last one I look at is UNC is going to go back out to Las Vegas again. Certainly, I'm not going to mind making that trip myself. And they're going to play against UCLA in Vegas in T-Mobile Arena as part of the CBS Sports Classic. Everyone saw what UCLA did in the NCAA tournament, saw how terrific they were, making it to the Final Four, coming within a crazy buzzer beater of making it to the championship game. They bring back every contributor to that squad, plus 2 new additions, a top recruit and a top transfer. That, I think, by that point, will be about a month into the season. We'll know if UNC is a legitimate top 25 team, or we'll know if this is a team that is still trying to find its footing as it transitions from one era to the next. So those are sort of the 4 games I'm looking at. I think we can learn something different from each of them, but all 4 of them against ranked opponents, great arenas, great venues. It's really a daunting non-conference schedule.
Always seems that way, Brendan, and you outlined it just right. And I think all of those matchups that you highlighted there are must-watch for any college basketball fan anywhere. All right. Again, Brendan, we're really thankful. Please don't forget to give Brendan some feedback, some support, some positivity over the college hoop season over at The Athletic CBB. And, of course, Brendan R. Marks at Brendan R. Marks. All right, let's get you out of here on this one, Brendan. Brendan, what do you think about this season? Just give us a gut prediction after maybe viewing open practice, taking a look at the schedule, and then getting a feel for what the roster looks like and is kind of sounding like in practice. What's your prediction for the Tar Heels this season?
Yeah, I think definitely this is a team that is NCAA tournament caliber. I don't think that's a question whatsoever. To me, really, and what I hope ends up happening, I hope I'm right here, not just for the sake of being right, but I think the way the ACC is shaping up this year, I very much predict that it's going to be a classic ACC battle between Duke and North Carolina for the regular season in the ACC tournament, championship. And obviously Virginia has been in that mix. Florida State has been in that mix. Georgia Tech last year was in that mix. But on paper, I think UNC and Duke are pretty clearly the 2 most talented teams. And they both have such interesting storylines. The end of one era at Duke, the beginning of a new era in Chapel Hill. They both have players who can play inside and out. I think that North Carolina is a bit older. They're a bit more experienced. They're a bit deeper. I think Duke probably has higher end individual talent. Some of their specific players. I mean, they've got a guy who's probably going to go number 1 overall next year. But I think exactly in Paolo Banchero. Yeah. I think those 2 teams, hopefully, for Coach K's last regular season game in Cameron, I hope the ACC is on the line for that game. That's what I'm predicting right now. I hope we get a 3rd matchup in the ACC tournament championship. But on paper, both of those teams are poised to sort of duke it out for the top of the ACC. I think UNC, if all goes according to plan, probably is no worse than a 6th seed in the tournament. I think that overall, when you look at the way the last few years have gone for North Carolina, for Hubert Davis's first season, I think a lot of UNC fans would call that a success.
That does sound pretty successful. And I think, all the listeners and all college basketball fans out there, Brendan, are going to cross their fingers and hope that little script that you laid out there comes out true.
Wouldn't that be quite nice?
I mean, there's always juice in that game anyway, even if they're, one of the teams is under 500. But if that's the case, boy, oh boy, get your popcorn ready. That sounds just about right. Again, please give Brendan a follow over at theathletic.com and at Brendan R. Marks over on the Twitter landscape. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you enlightening us about the ACC and UNC Tar Heels and, what Coach Davis has his hands on right now. And, good luck this season, and hopefully we can cross paths later.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait for the season to start.
Cheers. Cilantro. Grazie.